The call came in at 6:40 in the morning. A highway pileup on Interstate 40, 11 casualties, broken people arriving through the emergency room doors in waves that did not stop. Deja Monroe had been on shift since midnight. She moved from one patient to the next with the focus and unhurried efficiency of someone who has learned that panic is the most expensive thing you can bring into a room where people are already running out of time. She did not leave until the last patient was stable, because leaving before the last patient was stable was simply not something her hands knew how to do. Regardless of what else the day required of her, she made it to her car at 10:47 that night. Her hospital badge was still clipped to her chest. Her scrubs were wrinkled from 14 hours of continuous work. Her natural hair was pulled back in the loosened and perfect way that happens when a shift never gives you a moment to fix it properly. She had a plan for the evening. Doctor home, shower, sleep. The kind of plan that sounds simple until the body that has been running on adrenaline and purpose for the better part of a day finally gets quiet enough to feel how heavy it actually is. She pulled out of the Riverside Regional Medical Center parking lot onto Elvis Presley Boulevard and headed south. The Memphis night was warm and still, the kind of southern evening that sits on your skin like a second layer. She had the windows down. She was not thinking about anything except the road and the specific and necessary silence of a woman who has been surrounded by noise and urgency for 14 straight hours and has finally been given permission to simply exist without being needed. She did not see the patrol car until its lights came on behind her. Drop a comment right now telling us where you are watching from, because what is about to happen to Deja Monroe on this quiet stretch of road in Memphis, Tennessee is the kind of thing that changes everything. And she has absolutely no idea it is coming. The lights were red and blue and immediate. Deja checked her speed. 31 miles per hour in a 30 zone. She checked her mirrors, both tail lights working. Registration current, insurance paid. She pulled over to the shoulder of Elvis Presley Boulevard near Rains Road with the specific and unhurried calm of a woman who has nothing to hide and knows it. Officer Derek Briggs stepped out of the patrol car with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who has done this enough times that it has stopped feeling like a procedure and started feeling like a performance. 16 years on the force, 44 years old. The kind of officer who had learned early that the badge on his chest changed the arithmetic of every interaction he walked into, and had spent the better part of 2 decades making sure the people he stopped understood that arithmetic before he said a single word. He approached the driver's side window and looked at Deja Monroe the way certain officers look at certain drivers on certain streets in certain cities at certain hours of the night. Not with overt hostility, with the specific and practiced assessment of a man who has already made a decision and is now simply building the paperwork around it. License and registration, he said. Not please, not good evening. Just the words, flat and transcational, in the voice of someone who does not consider the person in front of them worth the additional syllables. Deja reached into her glove compartment slowly and deliberately. Visible hands, no sudden movements. The specific and exhausting performance of innocence that should never have to be performed at all. She handed him her license and registration without a word. Briggs looked at the documents. He looked at her. He looked at the car. A 2009 Honda Civic with 112,000 miles on it and a small crack in the passenger side mirror that had been there since the winter. He handed the documents back without looking at them again. "You know why I stopped you," he said. It was not a question. Deja said she did not. Briggs said the vehicle matched the description of a car involved in a disturbance earlier in the evening. He said it with the specific and practiced ease of a man who has used that particular phrase enough times that it no longer requires him to believe it. He asked her where she was coming from. Deja told him. Riverside Regional, 14-hour shift. She was a registered nurse in the emergency department. Briggs looked at her scrubs. He looked at her the way he had been looking at hers, and he walked up to the window. With the expression of a man who has heard explanations before and has learned to treat them as obstacles rather than information. He told her he was going to need her to step out of the vehicle. Deja did not move immediately. Not out of defiance, out of the specific and careful stillness of a woman who is counting. She was counting the way she had been trained to count. Years ago, in a different life, in a different building, wearing a different kind of badge. She was counting violations the way other people count breaths. 1. No valid reason for the stop. 2. No specific description provided. 3. No legal basis for exit request. She stepped out of the vehicle. She stood beside her car with her hands visible and her hospital badge on her chest in the specific quiet composure of someone who has been in rooms where the stakes were measured in lives rather than inconvenience, and has learned to move through smaller turbulence without losing her footing. Briggs told her he was going to conduct a search of the vehicle. Deja asked him on what grounds. Briggs said he detected an odor. And there it was, the phrase that required no evidence, no witness, no verification of any kind. The phrase that had been used so many times in so many traffic stops in so many American cities that it had become less a legal justification and more a signal. A signal that the decision had already been made and the search was going to happen regardless of what she said next. Deja said nothing. She stood on the shoulder of the road and watched Officer Derek Briggs search her vehicle with the methodical and unhurried efficiency of a man who knows that no one is watching, and that even if they were, it would not matter. But someone was watching. Pastor Darnell Webb had been driving home from a late church council meeting when he saw the patrol car lights on the shoulder of Elvis Presley Boulevard. He slowed down because he always slowed down when he saw lights on this particular stretch of road at this particular hour. He had lived in this neighborhood for 61 years. He had learned what certain lights at certain hours on certain streets meant for certain people. He pulled into the parking lot of a closed convenience store 40 yards back and took out his phone and pressed record without getting out of his car, because he had also learned that the most useful thing a witness could sometimes do was stay exactly where they were and keep the camera steady. Briggs found the medication bag on the passenger seat floor, a sealed pharmacy bag with a patient name on it. A prescription for a controlled pain medication that Deja had been asked to bring to a patient's family member after her shift. A task so routine in her department that she had not thought twice about it. She had the documentation in her phone. She had the attending physician's name. She had everything that would take 30 seconds to verify if verification was something Briggs was interested in. He was not interested in verification. He held up the bag and looked at Deja with the expression of a man who has just found exactly what he was looking for, which is the most dangerous expression a person in a position of authority can wear, because it means the outcome was decided before the search began. He told her she was under arrest. Deja Monroe stood on the shoulder of Elvis Presley Boulevard in her hospital scrubs, with her badge on her chest and her hands being cuffed behind her back, and she did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She did not beg. She said, clearly and calmly, that she was requesting to make a phone call and that she was invoking her right to remain silent until she had spoken with an attorney. Briggs put her in the back of the patrol car and drove toward Precinct 7 in the Whitehaven district with the specific and satisfied composure of a man who believes he has just done his job. He had no idea what he had actually just done. Stay with us, because what happens in the next 47 minutes is the kind of thing that most people in that precinct will spend the rest of their careers trying to forget. The processing room at Precinct 7 smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. Chief Raymond Tully was a large man with a red face and the specific and comfortable authority of someone who had been running this precinct for 11 years without anyone above him asking too many questions. He and Derek Briggs had come up together, rookies in the same class, the kind of friendship that gets built in the specific and pressurized environment of early police, work and calcif IES over time into something that looks like loyalty but functions more like mutual protection. Tully looked at the arrest report. He looked at the medication bag in the evidence tray. He looked at Deja Monroe sitting in the processing chair in her hospital scrubs, with her badge still on her chest and her hands folded in her lap, with a stillness that made him vaguely uncomfortable in a way he could not immediately name. He told her she could make one phone call. Deja picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. 11 digits. No hesitation. The kind of number you dial the number of someone you have called 1,000 times before, because you have. The phone rang twice. Eamon answered on the second ring. Deja said 4 words. Memphis, Precinct 7, tonight. Then she hung up and folded her hands back in her lap and waited with the specific and patient composure of a woman who has just set something in motion that cannot be stopped and understands that the only thing left to do now is wait for it to arrive. Chief Tully watched her from across the room. The uncomfortable feeling was growing stronger. He still had no name for it. He was about to find one. 47 minutes later, the name arrived with headlights. The first thing Precinct 7 heard was not sirens. It was something quieter and more deliberate than sirens. The low and continuous rumble of multiple heavy vehicles moving in coordinated formation. The specific sound that people who have heard it before recognize immediately, and people who have not heard it before feel in their chest before they understand what it is. Officer Wayne Pruitt was the first one to look out the front window. He stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "Chief, you need to see this." 7 black SUVs had positioned themselves around Precinct 7 with the specific and geometric precision of people who have done this before and understand that positioning is not about intimidation, but about making sure that every exit is accounted for before anyone inside has time to think about using one. A helicopter was audible somewhere above the building. The parking lot lights got the gold lettering on the side of the nearest vehicle and held it completely still and completely legible from inside the building. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Chief Tully walked to the window and stood beside Pruitt and looked at the parking lot for a long moment without speaking. The comfortable authority that had been sitting on his face since Deja Monroe was brought in had not disappeared all at once. It was leaving the way things leave when they were never fully earned, piece by piece, quietly, until what remained was something considerably smaller and more honest than what had been there before. Briggs came out of the back hallway when he heard the vehicles. He walked to the window and stood beside Tully and looked at the parking lot, and his body understood something that his mind had not yet fully processed. His hand moved toward his belt and then stopped moving. There was nothing on his belt that was useful to him right now. The front door of Precinct 7 opened. Special Agent in charge Leonard Hayes walked in. Hayes was 52 years old, 6 feet 1 inch tall, and wearing a dark suit that had not been purchased at a department store. He had the specific and unhurried bearing of a man who has walked into a great many rooms in his career and has never once needed to announce himself, because the room always knew. 26 years with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For years running the Memphis field office on Humphreys Boulevard. He had received a phone call 47 minutes ago from a number he recognized immediately, and he had been moving since the moment he ended that call. He looked at Chief Tully. He looked at Briggs. He looked around the room once with the careful and assembling attention of someone taking inventory. Then he looked at the processing area where Deja Monroe was sitting. He crossed the room in 12 steps and stood in front of her and looked at her the way a man looks at someone he has known for a long time and has not seen in a while, and is now seeing in circumstances that require him to be something other than simply glad to see her. He said, "Agent Monroe, not Ms. Monroe. Not ma'am, Agent Monroe." The room went very quiet. The kind of quiet that falls when a single word rearranges everything that everyone in the room thought they understood about the last 2 hours. Briggs felt it before he understood it. The specific and physical sensation of a floor that was solid 1 moment ago, becoming something considerably less certain beneath his feet. He looked at Deja Monroe in her hospital scrubs and her badge in her folded hands, and he began, for the first time since he turned on his patrol car lights on Elvis Presley Boulevard, to actually look at her. Not at what he had decided she was, at what she actually was. Hayes reached into his jacket and removed a leather credential case and opened it and set it on the processing desk facing outward, so that everyone in the room could read it without being asked to. The gold badge caught the fluorescent light of the processing room and held it. Special Agent Deja Monroe, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Public Corruption Task Force, 11 years of service. Badge number 8247, stamped into the metal with the specific and permanent authority of a federal document that does not require anyone's permission to mean what it means. Deja reached into the pocket of her scrubs and removed her own leather wallet and set it open on the desk beside Hayes's credentials without a word. The same badge, the same number, worn slightly at the edges from 11 years of daily contact with her hands. 2 federal badges on a precinct processing desk at 11:43 at night. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. Then Hayes turned to Chief Tully and began to speak in the quietened level voice of a man who is not performing authority, but simply carrying it. And the effect of that, of words that Large delivered in a voice that controlled, was something that neither Tully nor Briggs had any framework to respond to. Hayes told Tully that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been conducting a review of Precinct 7's traffic enforcement patterns for the past 8 months. He told him that the review had documented 43 stops in the Whitehaven district over that period in which the stated justification did not match the available evidence. He told him that Officer Derek Briggs had been the conducting officer in 31 of those 43 stops. He told him that the stop conducted tonight on Elvis Presley Boulevard had been recorded in its entirety from a distance of 40 yards by a civilian witness, whose footage was already in federal possession. He told him that Judge Harold Stokes of Shelby County Criminal Court, the same judge who had dismissed 23 prior complaints against Briggs without hearing, had been flagged in the federal review for a pattern of rulings that the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division was now examining with the specific and unhurried attention of people who have all the time in the world and all the documents they need. Tully said the department had always followed proper procedure. Hayes looked at him the way an experienced man looks at a statement he has heard many versions of and has never found particularly convincing. He said that proper procedure did not explain 31 stops with identical patterns over 8 months. He said that proper procedure did not explain why the dash camera footage from Briggs's patrol car on 14 of those 31 occasions had been marked as malfunctioning in the system log. He said that proper procedure did not explain why every single complaint filed against Briggs in the past 6 years had been reviewed and closed by the same supervising officer. He looked at Tully when he said that last part. Tully's face completed its transformation. The comfortable authority was gone entirely now. What remained was the specific and unflattering expression of a man who has just understood that the walls he believed were protecting him were actually the evidence against him, and that they had been building a case for 8 months while he sat in his office and signed off on paperwork and believed himself untouchable. Hayes turned to Briggs. He looked at him the way an experienced man looks at a problem he has seen many versions of and has always found straightforward. He told Briggs that he was being placed under federal investigation for civil rights violations under Title 42, Section 1983 of the United States Code. He told him that the medication bag currently in the evidence tray had already been identified as hospital property with documented chain of custody, and that the arrest report Briggs had filed contained 3 factual statements directly contradicted by the civilian footage already in federal possession. Briggs said it was a mistake. He said he was just doing his job. He said he had no way of knowing who she was. Hayes let him finish. Then he said, quietly and completely, that not knowing was not a defense available to a 16-year veteran of law enforcement who had conducted 31 stops with identical patterns over 8 months. He said that not knowing was a choice that had been made 31 times and that the federal government did not consider it a mitigating factor. He paused for one breath. Then he said that the 31 people who had been stopped on this road before tonight had not had a federal badge in their pocket, and that they had deserved the same answer that Briggs was receiving right now. They had simply not had the means to deliver it. The room was completely still. Deja Monroe stood up from the processing chair. She picked up her badge from the desk and held it for a moment in her palm. Badge number A2247, worn at the edges. 11 years of daily contact with her hands. She had carried it through 11 years of investigations on courtrooms and moments considerably more dangerous than a traffic stop on Elvis Presley Boulevard, and she had never once taken it out to show anyone who did not need to see it. She looked at Briggs. She did not say anything angry. She did not perform the satisfaction that the moment might have entitled her to. She simply looked at him with the specific and level attention of a woman who has spent 11 years studying the architecture of corruption and has learned that the most important thing you can do in the moment of its exposure is stay clear enough to see it completely. She said, I asked you on what grounds. You said odor. You knew there was no odor. You knew it before you said it. And you said it anyway because you have been saying it for 8 months and nothing has ever stopped you. She paused for one moment. That is what this is about. Not tonight. All of it. Every person you stopped on this road who did not have a federal badge in their pocket. Every single one of them deserved the same answer you are getting right now. They just did not have the means to deliver it. She put the badge back in her pocket and walked toward the door and did not look back. Outside, the Memphis night was still warm. The 7 black SUVs were still positioned around the building with their engines running. Agent Curtis Bowman was waiting by the nearest vehicle and handed her a jacket without a word because the adrenaline was wearing off and the night air was cooler than it had been 2 hours ago. She put it on and stood for a moment looking at the building she had just walked out of and then looked at the sky above it, where the helicopter was still circling with its light moving slowly across the rooftop. She thought about 31 stops. She thought about 31 people on this road on nights like this one. She thought about what it meant to have the means to deliver an answer that everyone deserved and not everyone received. She thought about the specific and permanent weight of that. Then she got in the vehicle and they drove toward the Memphis field office on Humphreys Boulevard, and the night continued around them, the way nights continue, without acknowledgement, without pause, simply moving forward because that is what nights do. The story ran on the 11 o'clock news. Simone Garrett had been in the parking lot of Precinct 7 with a camera crew for 31 minutes before Hayes walked through the front door, because Pastor Darnell Webb had called her from the convenience store parking lot 40 yards down Elvis Presley Boulevard while his phone was still recording. The footage ran at 11. It ran again at 6 in the morning. By 7:15 it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By 9 o'clock the Shelby County District Attorney had issued a statement. By noon, Officer Derek Briggs had been placed on unpaid administrative leave pending federal investigation. Chief Raymond Tully submitted his resignation that same afternoon. His attorney wrote the letter. It contained the specific and careful language of a man who has been advised to say as little as possible and has followed that advice with the precision of someone who finally understands what precision costs when you apply it too late. Judge Harold Stokes recused himself from all pending cases involving Precinct 7 officers 2 days later, citing a conflict of interest that he did not specify and that the Department of Justice did not require him to specify because they were already specifying it themselves in a federal filing that ran to 47 pages. The federal investigation into Precinct 7's traffic enforcement patterns was formally opened 6 days after the stop on Elvis Presley Boulevard. It identified 43 stops, 31 conducted by Briggs, a pattern of targeting that the federal complaint described in language that was precise and unambiguous, in that the Memphis Commercial Appeal ran on its front page of the Fold on a Tuesday morning in language that the people of the Whitehaven District had been using themselves for years without anyone in a position of authority writing it down and meaning it. Derek Briggs was indicted on for counts of civil rights violations under federal statute 14 months after the night he turned on his patrol car lights on Elvis Presley Boulevard. His attorney filed 3 motions to dismiss. All 3 were denied. The trial lasted 11 days in Shelby County Criminal Court. The civilian footage from Pastor Darnell Webb's phone was entered into evidence on day 3. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and 22 minutes. On the day the verdict was read, Briggs sat at the defense table and heard the word guilty 4 times in a row and did not move. His attorney placed a hand on his arm. Briggs did not acknowledge it. He sat very still with the specific expression of a man who has spent 14 months insisting that what he did was procedure, was protocol, was simply the job, and has just been told by 12 people who listened to 11 days of evidence that it was none of those things. The courtroom cleared. His attorney gathered the papers. The gallery emptied. The bailiff waited by the side door. Briggs sat alone at the defense table for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The court reporter noted it in her log because she had been instructed to note the time of all departures. When the bailiff finally moved toward him, Briggs stood slowly. He walked toward the side door, and then he stopped. He turned and looked back at the empty courtroom, at the empty gallery, at the empty chair where Deja Monroe had sat for 11 days with her hands folded in her lap and her badge in her pocket, and the specific and patient composure of a woman who had already done the hardest part and was now simply waiting for the institution to catch up. He stood there for a moment that the bailiff would later describe as the longest moment of his career. Then he said something under his breath, quietly, not to anyone in particular, the way a person says something when they are finally saying it to themselves rather than to an audience. He said, "I didn't see her." The victim advocate, a quiet woman named Beverly Cross who had sat in the gallery for all 11 days, heard it. She said later that she did not think he meant that night on Elvis Presley Boulevard. She thought he meant something larger than that. She thought he meant all 31 stops. All 43. All the people he had looked at and processed through a filter so thick and so old and so unexamined that the actual human being on the other side of it had never once made it through. She said she thought it was the first honest thing he had said in 14 months. She said she hoped it was not the last. The Memphis City Council passed the White Heaven Traffic Enforcement Accountability Act 7 months after the indictment. It required body cameras on all patrol officers in the district, mandatory supervisory review of all traffic stops within 48 hours, an independent civilian oversight board with subpoena authority. The bill passed 14-1. The one dissenting vote did not give a public statement. Precinct 7 got a new chief. Her name was Andrea Lawson. 22 years on the force. A reputation for the specific and unfashionable belief that accountability was not the enemy of good policing but the condition of it. On her first day, she held a meeting with every officer in the precinct and said one thing that the officers who were there would remember for a long time afterward. She said, "The badge is not a shield, it is a promise. And a promise only means something if you keep it when it is inconvenient." Nobody in the room said anything, but 3 officers who had been present on the night of the stop on Elvis Presley Boulevard and had said nothing at the time submitted written statements to the federal investigators the following week. Not because they were required to, because they had heard what Andrea Lawson said and understood, perhaps for the first time, what the alternative to silence actually looked like when it arrived in 7 black SUVs verses at 11:43 at night. Deja Monroe was back at Riverside Regional Medical Center the morning after the verdict, in the emergency department by 6:45. Badge on her chest, scrubs pressed, hair pulled back in the specific and practical way of a woman who has work to do and has never needed the work to announce itself. A younger nurse named Tamara asked her how she was doing and Deja said fine and meant it in the specific and complete way that people mean it when they have been through something large and have come out the other side with everything they went in with still intact. She did not talk about the trial at work. She did not talk about the stop. She did not talk about the badge or the 7 SU verses or the 11 days in court or the 4 counts of guilty read in a row in a room that had gone completely still. She talked about the new triage protocol the department was piloting. She talked about the highway pileup from 14 months ago and the 11 casualties who had all gone home eventually on the specific and permanent weight of the work that never fully leaves the hands that do it. At the end of her shift, she sat in her car in the Riverside Regional parking lot for a few minutes before starting the engine. She took the leather wallet out of her scrub pocket and opened it and looked at the gold badge, number A2247, worn slightly at the edges. 11 years of daily contact with her hands. She thought about 31 stops. She thought about the people who had been in those cars on those nights on that road without a federal badge in their pocket. She thought about Beverly Cross and what she had said about the last thing Briggs said in the empty courtroom. "I didn't see her." Deja sat with that for a moment in the specific and honest way that she sat with difficult things. Not pushing it away, not letting it become larger than it was, just holding it at the exact size it actually was and looking at it clearly. He had not seen her. He had not seen any of them. He had looked at 31 people on 31 nights on the same road and had seen only what his assumptions had already decided was there, and had built 16 years of authority on top of a foundation that had never once been asked to hold the weight of an actual human being standing in front of it. That was the thing. That was the whole thing. Not the badge, not the federal investigation, not the 7 SU verses or the 4 counts of guilty, or the 14 months of proceedings that had finally ended in a courtroom in Memphis on a Tuesday afternoon. The thing was that every single one of those 31 people had been a complete and entire human being with a life and a history and a reason for being on that road at that hour. And not one of them had needed a federal badge to make that true. They had simply needed someone willing to see it. She closed the wallet and put it back in her pocket and started the car. She pulled out of the parking lot onto Elvis Presley Boulevard and headed home through the Memphis evening, warm and still, the windows down, the badge in her pocket, and the specific and quiet composure of a woman who has done something that mattered and is already thinking about what comes next. Because that is what the people who carry things forward do. They do not stop at the step they just took. They look at the road ahead and they keep moving, because the people behind them are still walking and the people ahead of them are still waiting, and the distance between where things are and where things ought to be does not close itself. It closes because someone decides to close it. And some people were born for exactly that. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that dignity is not something that gets issued with a badge or a title or a seat at the right table, that it belongs to every single person standing on the side of that road at 10:47 at night with their hands visible in their documents, in order and their humanity entirely intact, then subscribe and stay with us. Because every single week we bring you another story about the people who carry the weight quietly and never ask for the acknowledgement and show up anyway. Because showing up is simply what they do. Those are the stories that should never be forgotten, and we are not going to let them be. This story is a work of fiction created for educational and storytelling purposes. Names, characters, and incidents are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The story is intended to explore themes of human dignity, accountability, and justice, and does not represent or accuse any real individual, organization, or law enforcement agency.